Hello and welcome to our Q&A session, our webinar following on from the recent podcast series, all about psychological flexibility. I'm Dr. Richard MacKinnon, chartered psychologist and coach. And as with the podcast episodes, I'm joined today by...
Hello, everyone. Ross McIntosh here, organizational psychologist and coach, continuing this collaboration with Richard and looking forward to reviewing a few questions today.
Brilliant. So today is all about answering questions that we're getting live during the webinar and that have been sent in already to bring a little bit more clarity to what we've covered. And if you're finding this recording on YouTube and it's the first bit you've seen, the first thing that you should know is that we're talking about a quality called psychological flexibility, when we're able to use certain skills to develop our capacity to be more present in the moment, to deal effectively with the kind of thoughts and emotions our mind gives us, to be clear on what matters, and to do more of the stuff that matters. And this quality, this skill set contributes to our well-being and our performance at work. So we're big fans of it, but not just because of that. It's got a really good evidence base supporting it. And it's a skill set that we teach people and we bring to life in coaching on a regular basis. So I will link to it below, but the resources for this series can be found at worklifepsych.com/psychological flexibility. Every time I have to say that or write that, I have a little twinge of regret. I didn't think of a shorter page name, but anyway, it is what it is. And you can contact us via there as well. So while we're waiting for attendees to send in questions, and sometimes people just listen, and that's okay too. Ross, let's answer the first question that I received. Can you explain the difference between towards moves and away moves? And actually, that's a simplification of a few questions that came through on that topic. So we touched on the concept of looking at our behavioral options through the lens of towards and away. How would you like to explain that?
Oh, right. Yeah, great question. And I'd go with talking about towards moves. Towards moves is taking small steps with our behavior. So it's expressing what matters to us. We might call those our personal values. But maybe thinking about an area of life, maybe a relationship, for example, and thinking about what's important to me about this relationship, what gives me meaning, and we'd call them personal values, and then working out how you express them in your behavior and taking small steps that represent those values in your behavior. So that's how I'd have a first go at describing a towards move. And an away move. So when we think about things that are important to us, say, continuing with my example of a relationship, it's like two sides of the same coin. So when we think about how we'd like to be, there's other stuff that shows up, things like thoughts, emotions, memories, sensations, urges. They can also show up in our inner world, that world between our ears. And that stuff can really get in the way of us expressing our values. It can hijack our attention and hijack our behavior. And typically, if we're seeking to get relief from that uncomfortable stuff inside of us, it would typically be expressed as an away move. Things like, let me try and think of an example in a relationship. Things like avoiding a conversation, things like being a bit withdrawn, things like being a bit irritable. That could be driven by stuff that's showing up inside of us, a memory, a thought, or an emotion. And I think just to finish with that, we'll always do both. We'll always do towards and away moves using an approach like ACT and psychological flexibility. Psychological flexibility, you'd think I'd be able to say that by now. It doesn't turn everyone into saints that are only doing towards moves. The objective is not to just, oh, look, I've done this training, I only do towards moves now. No. The idea is that we become more aware of when we're doing towards moves and when we're doing away moves. And if we can notice an away move, that's kind of a cue for us to think, what in the next moment can I do to take me towards what matters to me? How can I reconnect with what matters? So that was a bit of a TED talk. That was quite long, but hopefully it made sense. And
Yeah.
Richard, maybe if you unpick that a bit more, give your perspective, because I think this is what the beauty of us working together
Mm.
brings is our different perspectives.
I I wouldn't disagree with anything you said. I think one of the really useful things about looking at behavioral options and reviewing our behavior in terms of towards and away is that it's not pass fail and it's not
Mm,
good bad. And so what we're not doing is setting up new rules for ourselves, but instead saying, if I do that thing, if I behave that way, it moves me towards what I think is important and meaningful. And maybe it's a goal, or maybe it's who I want to be. And if I do that thing, I'm trying to avoid or minimize or struggle with something uncomfortable. And that's not a failure. That's part of being human, but we're recognizing it, as you say. And maybe that's giving me a cue to try and do something different next time or do something different
mm,
immediately. But I really like it because it prompts reflection and it prompts the noticing of trends in our behavior. And as I say, it moves away from good, bad. And I think just one more thing I'll throw in, and this gives people pause for thought. I've noticed it's always contextual. So what we're not doing is coming up with a list of here are your towards moves you must always do, and here are away moves you must never do, because the same behavior in different contexts could be an away move or a towards move. So we're not looking for rigidity, we're looking for flexibility, as the name would suggest. So what it does require us to be able to do, I would argue, is be present in the moment to notice we have options and that focusing on our options in any moment to say, well, what would I like to do? What would be helpful to do? And if I'm honest with myself, what am I tempted to do to get away from this little twinge of whatever kind of uncomfortable stuff shows up? And I think it's something that is almost freestanding in a sense. Even if you don't get to grips with all of the other stuff we've been talking about, if you just notice a little bit more about is what I'm doing moving me to where I want to get to, or moving me away from something temporarily uncomfortable. That's a neat little reflective tool, I would
mm,
suggest. And I know from my experience as well, bringing it to life in coaching, it's something that stays with people. They come back with that all the time, whereas some of the other ideas maybe don't always, or they're not as memorable. So I hope
mm.
that's answered that question about towards and away moves. Please get in touch if you'd like to know more. And we have talked about it a little bit more when we referenced when we did our episode on committed action, putting values into action. Ross, next question. Why does it matter so much for me to clarify my values? So why would I do that in the first place?
Oh, great one. So I'm going to start talking about our values and how I think some values can be a rich seam, like a seam that go through our whole lives. If you're thinking about rock formations and layers of rock, some values can be a rich seam that go through our whole lives. And some values will become more prominent or less prominent as we move through our lives. And sometimes as chapters change in our lives, we might have new values that become far more important to us. Or we might have realizations or job changes or life changes, things like births, marriages, deaths, separations. These can all make us pause and reflect on who we want to be. Now, we might not typically reflect on, oh, I wonder if my values have changed. But I would recommend people check in regularly with their values, say in relation to different life areas, maybe in relation to work, in relation to their own health, in relation to leisure time, and in relation to relationships. So that's one way to divide them up. But I think it's really healthy and effective to revisit our values with some level of frequency to to help us move towards what matters and not be using an old template of what we think mattered before, but the context around us has changed. And why would you want to do this in the first place? Why would you want to start exploring your values? Well, to see with an open mind and maybe curiosity about what is important to you, using that gut instinct, because there might also be surprises or insights into doing an exercise where you just generally and gently explore your own values. I'm going to pause there rather than continue burbling, Richard. But what do you reckon?
Not burbling at all. Absolutely, yes. I think I answer that question because it does come up when you suggest to this is a useful thing to do. Why? My standard answer is to help you figure out what really matters.
Mm.
You know, what matters to you. So if you know what matters, to be blunt, then you can figure out what doesn't matter so much. And maybe you don't need to wind yourself up or spend so much time and attention on that when you've really figured out what matters to you. It also enables things like being more authentic because we can easily find ourselves involved in something. And in the workplace, it could be the pursuit of, let's say, a promotion. When actually, if we pause to consider what really matters to me, that promotion might not matter at all. Seniority might not be important. Something
Mm.
else might trump that regularly. And we think, well, why would I put myself through this if it doesn't matter to me in any sense? I'm not being authentic to me. I'm doing it maybe because it's expected of me. And I find that when people work through and bring some clarity to what matters to them, it's simply another tool in the toolkit. It helps us use them to guide decisions and behavior rather than what we might get swept up in the moment, like emotions or groupthink or just popularity or social pressure. So
Mm.
we could list so many ways that familiarity with and use of values is beneficial for us. But I think it's also one of the main things that helps us do the stuff that's difficult, do the stuff that's uncomfortable, do the stuff that's tiresome and bothersome. And, if we didn't have to, we wouldn't do it. If we know that's who I want to be, that's the kind of person I want to be. And it doesn't mean that I have to like it. It's
Mm.
me being that way. So yeah, it's an important one. I've just seen a question come through. Ross, did you say values can be a rich seam or a rich theme? If seam, would you be able to say a bit more about the use of that metaphor for values, as it's got me wondering?
Oh, yes, thank you. I did say seam, SEAM. I'm thinking about, probably quite obscurely, I'm thinking about rock formations. You know, when you take a cross section of a slice of the earth, and you might see a seam of gold or a seam of a precious metal, and you know how these rock layers are built up over time. So what I'm suggesting, I don't know if this metaphor works, is that sometimes there'll be a seam that runs through our whole life, that from start to end, a rich seam of a particular value that really matters to us throughout the life. And others may come and go. So that's what I was trying to get at. I don't know if that makes things clearer, but that's what I was kind of intending to get at.
I really like it because it does speak to stability. So thank you. Yes, it does. Thanks, Caroline, for that question. Please keep them coming, or just comment as you see fit as we go through this. I think there's another aspect that I would add to that, which is that when we take the time, at least initially, to figure out what matters to us, it can be uncomfortable because we realize maybe we've neglected some of that stuff. And it is like a seam running through our life, but we maybe haven't given it the attention or lived it that we might otherwise do. So it can be uncomfortable, but that just reminds us, hey, it is important to me. And maybe now it's time to bring my attention and my time and my energy to that aspect of me. So that's
Mm.
the difference between saying, I think, family focus is important versus making the time to dedicate my time, attention, and energy to family in whatever way that comes to life. So it can be a challenging activity, but a really worthwhile activity. And as I say, another tool in the toolkit. Now, I'm going to follow that up with another question about values. It is
Mm.
a big part of, in my experience, when running workshops, it gives people a lot of pause for thought because we're talking about something quite fundamental. It's you at your very core. So this next question is, I put it in the top 5 questions about values. What if the people around me don't share my values? What do we think about that?
Yeah, I recognize that question, Richard, because where to begin on this one? Well, first of all, to think about the wording of the question, I'd say, well, that's okay. And I wouldn't expect everyone around you to share the exact combination and set of values that you have. In fact, I'd be very surprised if you were completely aligned, because the beauty of personal values is just that they're personal to us, and each combination can be fairly unique. So, what do we control when we're interacting with other human beings? My view is we could only control how we show up, the words that come out of our mouth, our behavior, our actions. So, in that sense, we can use our values as a guide for how we show up, but we can't control how other people might respond. But knowing our values can help us realize that maybe the way other people are responding reflects that they have a different set of values. And maybe sometimes it can unlock conversations that help us appreciate the perspective of other people a little more deeply. So that's my initial stab. I'd love to hear what you think, Richard, just to see if there's anything I can build on that for this question.
As I said, it's a really common question because it also sort of illustrates one of the traps we can fall into when we think about values. On the one hand, there's good and bad values, and therefore the people around me need to share my good values. Otherwise, the inference is conflict, which absolutely isn't the case. And yes, I agree. It would be very surprising if everyone in life shared our values. But I would also say that someone might espouse certain values if they talk about them at all, but their behavior could be very different to yours, even if you say you share values. And of course, you could say you've got completely different values and your behavior could look very, very similar. The the labels we give our values, I would argue, are far less important than the fact that we've noted them for ourselves and then we try and bring them to life. In fact, if someone has different values, it can be a real source of richness, of vitality to a relationship as long as we talk about it. Because if we don't talk about what's important to us and what's meaningful to us, then each party runs the risk of assuming motivation and judging rather than being curious. It doesn't mean we have to agree, but it means that we understand more about what's going on for someone. This is important to me. This is why I emphasize it. This is really meaningful to me. This is why I don't want to let this go in my life and not do any of it. Or this is something I hadn't considered people value. Isn't that interesting? Rather than there's right and wrong. And I
Mm,
think that's difficult to get our heads around, isn't it? Because this is where I think there's a blurred line, or yeah, a perceived blurred line maybe would be the way I'd put it, between values and things like ethics or the law. They're much more rigid. They're much more like rules. And you can say to someone, you have not stuck to that ethical framework. In fact, you've behaved, in a way that's the antithesis of that ethical framework. Or you could say to someone, you've broken the law. We've seen you break the law. And with those things, there's consequences. But with values, they're not rules, they're not rigid, they are flexible. So the inference is that there are multiple ways to bring them to life. So to come back to the question, if people around you don't share their values, your values. They have their values. Isn't it interesting to find out more about how they're bringing them to life and what impact that has, rather than a judging it different, so it's not good, or it's different and I don't like it. No, it's just different. It's
Mm.
different. And fundamentally, it would be nice if more people were clear on what matters and did more of that stuff rather than get caught up with worries, anxieties, or behaved automatically. And maybe the final thing I'll throw in on this, because it's a sort of a sub question for this, the organization I work for or belong to, what about if their values are different to mine? And the way that I answer that normally is, look, most organizational values are so positively framed and pretty bland, to be honest. They all sort of emphasize similar things, playing nicely together, doing good work, moving us forward, those kinds of things. Get clear on your values and then look about how you might express them in that general direction. I mean, unless you work for an organization that says one of our key values is domination of the world or destruction of art and beauty, you're going to find some commonality there. It mightn't be total, absolutely. And you may find that some of your values are difficult to bring to life at work, and outside of work might be the domain to do that. So your values are yours. Don't expect them of others or other organizations. Work at clarifying them and bringing them to life and noticing the difference that makes. And also, without using the values word, bring them to life for other people so they can better understand who you are as a person. How does that sound to you, Ross?
Love it. Love it. Yeah, absolutely. And just going back to the point you made in the first question, it's all contextually based. So there's the flexibility part of psychological flexibility is important to notice the context and think how you might express this value in that context, or you might dial it down to zero in that particular context. So it's just really becoming more alive to what's around us, and then thinking how to express what matters. So thank you. Great question.
And you're preempting the next question on the list, which
Oh,
for viewers, Ross hasn't seen, which is another really common one about this. And so I've distilled it down into how do I decide which of my values to bring to life, which speaks to the contextual point you just made.
good question. Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, it takes you noticing where you are, what context you're in. Are there people around you? Is there a specific challenge or set of circumstances around you? And then it's just reflecting which of my core values might serve me most effectively in this context I find myself in, and what would small steps look like as I'm moving towards that value, and taking those small steps in a kind of curious and experimental way, because then you'll get more data back about how that's impacting, and you might think, oh no, maybe that's not values not particularly serving me in this actual situation. So I'll dial up another one, or I'll call upon a fresh one just for this specific set of circumstances I find myself in. Now that's a long way of describing just becoming more familiar and agile with our values and getting a bit creative on how we might express them in different circumstances and being willing to have a go. We might not be expressing a value with complete certainty. I'd recommend you start to express it with kind of curiosity and perhaps even a playful experimental approach to see, I think this value might serve me. Let's have a go. Let's see how I can bring that to life in what I'm about to do or say and see how it lands. And then the data I get back can help me then think, shall I continue on this trajectory or shall I adjust my path slightly? So that's how I'd respond to that.
That's a really nice way of putting it. I think the image people sometimes have is that lying in front of me on the desk here, I've got 6 values and I must choose one for the next 30 minutes. something quite mechanistic and
Mm.
structural. But actually, it could be as simple as, and this is the way I do it. It doesn't mean you have to do it, but I sort of ask myself, what kind of person do I want to be in these moments I'm in? And reflect on the values that I espouse. So, and it could be as drastically different as I want to be the kind of person who looks after himself, engages in self care. So, I'm going to down tools and I'm going to go for a walk in the park down the street. But on another day, in a very similar day, I might say, I want to be the kind of person who's dependable and meets his deadlines. And so what I'm going to do is persist with this achingly boring task while I'm looking outside at blue skies and sunshine and wishing I was in the park. And it's not that, for example, to be honest, it's not that we only bring one value to life at a time, but we might be leaning into one, but we're
Mm.
much more complex than one label. In fact, it's important that we recognize that. And so, to underline a point you made there, that experimentation, that playfulness, that curiosity, it, that is made easier by practice. The more we practice living our values, the more we'll know what it feels like to do it and know the many ways we can express them. If you work at clarifying your values and file them neatly away and never do anything with them until there's a crisis, then you won't know as well how it is to use them. So that's why I frame them as a tool. The more we use the tool, the more we know how to use the
Mm.
tool and the more expert we become with it. So knowing the many ways you can express self-care, the many ways you can express professionalism, the many ways you can express compassion, rather than saying compassion's on the list, but I don't really do it unless I'm forced into it. That's not going to be as helpful. We've had another question come through on the webinar chat. I'm wondering if I have an organizing value that all my values sit within that is not contextualized, but then helps guide which value might support that in a context. How does that sit with your thoughts? So thank you for that question. If I understand it, it's possibly like a meta value or an overarching um, expression. And I won't say, oh, so yes, okay. So this is why doing things live is great, but also difficult. One way that people sometimes express that is I have um, a belief system and a moral compass, and all my values kind of head in the same direction as an expression of that. So something like, this is what I wish for me and the people around me. And all the other words I use to describe my values are in alignment with that. Because the thing to remember that unlike, say, if you were doing a statistical analysis, now bear with me here. If you're doing a statistical analysis and you're looking at what are the different factors or slices of the cake we can identify here in this data, you want your factors to be separate to each other and identifiable as things. Values aren't really like that. There's often a lot of overlap between them. They speak to each other because what you're really trying to do is to bring a sense of meaning to your own life. And that's not neat. So it's to come back to the core question, it's absolutely, I would argue, uh, a sense-making activity that you have this overarching, look, this is me in a nutshell, and these are all the other things that support me in being that kind of person. And we do this all the time with groups, don't we? When we ask them to identify their most important values.
Mm.
Yeah. Oh, wait, hold on. I want to be all things. But imagine if you couldn't be all these things, which would be the ones that you'd put at the top of the list. So, as Ross said earlier, we're revisiting them, we're reimagining them, we're reflecting our context and our changing life circumstances. So, I don't think it matters as much how we organize them as much as they're authentic and we bring them to life. They're the key things that we're looking for here, not a framework that you could defend in a court of law.
Mm.
Ross, what do you think? This is such a great question. That's why it's taking me a little bit longer to answer it.
Yeah, absolutely agree with your position. There might be times when an overarching value you really want to choose to dial it down in a particular context. It might not be appropriate, or there might be different ways to combine the other values. I go back to my approach of curiosity and playfulness and experimentation. I wouldn't want to get too rigidly attached to any one value, because sometimes if you're thinking, oh, I've really got to express this overarching value, it might be a detriment to yourself, which sometimes you might choose to do. But sometimes if that continues, then it's not particularly helpful or supportive of our general well-being. It might all become kind of a burden upon us. So I agree with Richard. It's how we express them and how we continue to practice to express them in new and perhaps novel ways in different contexts.
We can, of course, and we discussed this on the podcast, I think, we can become fused with values, and then they're no longer values, they're rules. They turn into I must be ... rather than I choose to behave this way in this context because reasons. So it's something to look out for. Absolutely. As long as we remember to be flexible and contextual, the what we do or choose not to do, which is also an expression of values, is going to be effective or a good fit, or at least responsive to what's happening. So that's the one thing, yeah, to watch out for. Dial up, dial down, check in to see if it's still helpful, or if one theme, because that's another way of expressing these things, themes in life, and then the expression of that in different ways, in different circumstances. All we're talking about here, if you want to keep it nice and simple, is just being intentional, really, and being intentional about how we respond and where we put our energy, what we do, what we don't do. And the intention has some background to it, some kind of formula. This is how I'd like to be, and I'm going to intentionally be that way more often than not. And that's what it boils down to: doing the important stuff, doing the meaningful stuff. And it has come up maybe once or twice in my career where values clarification has been really tough for someone, because what they're wedded to is either a rigid framework they've inherited from their upbringing, much more kind of rules based or morals based, or where someone just points to one or two things. This is me. I boil down to these things, when of course those values might not be as helpful in every single circumstance you're going to find yourself in. Now, there isn't I'm not aware of a perfect number of values. We're not looking for that, but we want to keep it flexible enough that you're going to be able to navigate a variety of situations, and simple enough that you'll know what they are and why you're doing what you're doing, but also used. So a very simple thing I suggest that my workshop attendees do, and coachees sometimes, is fill a post-it note with those top 5, top 6 things. Get that post-it note in front of you, familiarize yourself with it, and then you can question it and change it and say, actually, that's not a word I want to use. And they're yours. They're yours. It's not one and done. So you keep them alive by practicing them, by maybe finding a different word, by looking for opportunities to bring them to life, by experimentation. But there is no values exam we're all going to sit. There is no pass fail with values. There's only learning and refining and, yeah, and experimentation. What a great question. Now, another question that was dropped in before we started, which touches on values as well. I think there's a couple of ways of answering this. How can I remember the values-based habits I'm carrying out? So this stemmed from a point in a workshop, which was, look, there's different ways we can get familiar with our values and bring them to life. But a really simple way is to cultivate a values-based habit or a values-aligned habit. Do a simple thing each day. Note how you feel, what it's like to do it. It's a real, I describe it as the gateway drug to doing more meaningful stuff. But how do you remember to do it? Well, one way is to just stick that habit in the middle of a routine that you do anyway. So make it part of your morning routine or your commute routine or your evening routine. You're going to do it as part of that rather than rely on a reminder or something mechanistic like that. So when I've finished my coffee, I'll do the thing. When I've stacked the dishwasher, I'll do the thing. Uh, Writers call this habit stacking, but all you're doing is just making it easy for yourself to make sure it's part of it. But the other side to this is knowing that you've done it and noticing what difference that makes over time, because we're
Mm.
not looking for magical results because you've, I don't know, done mindful breathing for 20 seconds. But actually, noting that you've done or not done the thing over time is where keeping a record of that can be really useful. A visual record of your behavior is very powerful because it's much more accurate than our memory. And then you're able to look back and go, oh, I did the thing. I went for a walk in the park every day for 20 days, and I missed that day and I missed that day. I wonder what was going on. I wonder why I didn't do it. What am I learning about myself rather than there's a prize at the end of
Mm.
this if I keep doing the thing. So ideally, because of the way our minds work, our brains work, it's not helpful to try and remember to do something. Quick plug, I have interviewed a neuroscientist for the podcast, and we've got an episode coming up about her niche, which is prospective memory, remembering to do something in the future. And the advice is don't, if you can help it, outsource that to a piece of paper, an app, a reminder, something, because remembering to remember depletes your ability to focus in the here and now. So anything you can do that gives you a physical reminder in your environment that you said you wanted to do this, that's going to take the pressure off your your memory.
Mm.
Very long answer. Ross, how can I remember the values-based habits I'm carrying out? What do you think?
Ooh, well, I heartily agree with everything you've said, and I can't wait for that episode to drop, Richard. It sounds great. So I like writing stuff down. So writing down our values, maybe as Richard was saying, our top three, our top four values, maybe putting them around the house a bit, putting them on the bathroom mirror. So as you're doing your morning ablutions, you can go, oh yeah, that's what's important to me. Are there opportunities today when I might be able to bring those values to life? We're looking for cues in our environment. We used to, in the early days, me and Paul Flaxman, we used to give out those little, those silicon wristband type things. We used to give out those as part of the training to say, this is to remind you. When you see that, that's to remind you about your values. It's kind of a cue, a
Mm.
visual cue. So maybe also setting an alarm on your phone, maybe morning, lunchtime, at transition points, maybe if you're working towards the end of the day, thinking about maybe I've chosen one value that I want to build habits around. How can I do that? And just reminding yourself to have a go at that and getting really curious about, oh, how could I bring that to life when I meet with my friends or when I get home and see my partner? What would that value look like? And just getting really curious and playful about different ways to express it. So that's the way I'd approach it. And if you notice you've kind of gone a couple of days and you've forgotten to even reflect on this value, being kind to yourself. There's a lovely quote, which I think I said in the episode. If a value is important to you and you notice your misalignment with it and how you're behaving, you can always gently return to that value. And it's difficult to imagine a value that's important to us without envisaging a lifetime of gentle returns to that value. Now, I've kind of butchered that quote, but hopefully you get the idea that if something's important to us, we won't always bring it to life. We won't always build habits around it, and that's okay because we can always gently return to it and find other ways to express it.
That's a really nice way of putting it. And I remember that because we talked then about compassion, having
Mm,
that self-compassion and then just reconnecting with it, picking it up again. And yes, making notes, noting when things have happened and when they haven't gives you an insight into maybe what in your own life might be friction against doing that thing and maybe finding another way to do it or another time to do it or another expression of it. There's maybe another misconception we'll touch on now, which is sometimes, at least early days when we discuss it, people think values-based action is going to be something huge, really significant and obvious to other people. And of course, it's not. It could be, but that's not a great place to start. A great place to start would be to say I'm really reconnecting with my physical health as being one of my priorities, looking after this body I have. So this week, I'm going to take the stairs and not the escalator when I get to the shopping mall. This week, I'm going to walk to the office one more bus stop away. Right. So I'm not going to enter a marathon. I'm not going to sign up for a triathlon. I'm just going to get a few more steps in each day. And that symbolizes to me investment in that expression of that. And it's something I'm doing, so I'll notice I'm doing it. So we don't want to start with the huge stuff. We want to get familiar with what it's like and how the many ways we can express it. And that familiarity builds the habitual nature of bringing them to life and the familiarity of the different things we can bring to life in its stead. If we're not able to do one thing, there's something else that we can do.
Mm.
So flexibility, really, really key to this. And your expression of values isn't a all or nothing. I think that's really important. It doesn't have to be something that anyone else even notices you doing. You've done it. It's symbolic of something important to you. That's what really matters at the beginning. They were all the questions that came through in advance of our session today. So thank you to everyone who got in touch with those. This is one of those topics that always prompts questions. Once people have had a chance to think about it, maybe experiment with it a little bit. I'm going to take this opportunity to plug our new course. I'll be launching a course in November of this year, 2024, in case you're watching this much, much later. But it's going to be psychological flexibility for well-being, a blended learning course, including some self-directed e-learning content, followed by a series of live webinars with Ross and I, where the goal is to help you bring the principles of ACT to life with a view to boosting your well-being in whatever way that works for you. So not new year, new me, or anything like that, but the reconnection with what's important to do more of the things that you think will contribute to your well-being. All the details of that are going to be, well, they're going to be everywhere, if I'm honest, because I really want as many people to know about this as possible. If you found information about us on LinkedIn, it's going to be on LinkedIn. If you're subscribed to the newsletter at worklifepsych.news, it's going to be there. It'll be on all the socials, and I'll be talking about it on the podcast. But it's a new departure for me. But I think the interest that we've had in going through these episodes together, the questions, the conversation it's led to, I really want those people who maybe don't work in an organization that wants to bring in training, maybe work for an organization that hasn't got the budget for training, but they themselves want to do something. Interested individuals will be able to sign up and do that training with us. Ross, anything to throw into any of the points that we've covered so far, or any FAQs you get that you'd like to answer while we're live?
Hmm. Well, just before I do that, just an echo of Richard's enthusiasm about the course where we're going to be co-presenting in November. Look out for all the details on that, because it's something which allows us to continue our collaboration and to serve you effectively. So please do check it out once it's live. I'll give one more FAQ, Richard. How about this?
Perfect.
People who've listened to our episodes will be familiar with the idea that we can use a metaphor called the passengers on the bus to represent our unhelpful thoughts. So if we're moving in a direction that has meaning and purpose for us, sometimes those passengers, that chatter can start up and be distracting, be telling us we're not as good as the other bus drivers around us, or telling us to stay in our comfort zone, or telling us we're no good. Some of these passengers, i.e., our thoughts, can be quite harsh. And it's interesting sometimes the questions you get around this metaphor. And there's one that comes up quite a lot when people say, because, no, I'll take a step back, because in ACT, what we're trying to do is change our relationship with our thoughts. We're trying to recast our relationship with those uncomfortable thoughts or passengers. And some people say to me, well, I have my own approach. I just throw all the passengers off the bus and then I can drive along freely. And I never want to negate someone's strategy or approach, but I'd always be curious about how that works for them. How does that work? Because looking at the evidence on this, it basically suggests that we might be able to kind of block out those thoughts or keep a lid on them for a period of time. But quite often that lid just blows off again and the thoughts are back. It's like if we have managed to chuck all the passengers off our bus, all those unhelpful ones. For me, how I'd relate is that they run down the street, put on a disguise like maybe some comedy glasses and a mustache and a false nose, and they get back on the bus. And when they do that, they tend to have more vigor and more attention-grabbing strategies. And that's called rebound. So I would say have a go at using the skills we share to change your relationship with those passengers rather than trying to force them off the bus. So that's one that comes up for me. I don't know if you've got any reflections on that, Richard.
We've had one through on the live chats. That made me think of people choosing to handpick their passengers and perhaps even give them a script, which would also be an away move. Yeah, it's that selective manipulation or attempted manipulation
Yeah.
of your thoughts and all the other stuff your mind gives you. And that's a common answer I get in workshops as well. Well, I throw them off. You got to throw them off. And actually, if you want to be the best bus driver you can be, then that means you don't throw passengers off. You focus on doing the best job you can do, given the passengers you have. And the next day there might be different passengers, and the next day there'll be different passengers, and some of them will be repeat offenders, and some of them will say new and surprising things to you. But if you take your eye off the road, it's not going to be an effective bus journey for anyone. And this is one that really resonates with people and is very memorable as well, because our temptation is to not like backseat drivers.
Mm.
But, you know, the more you engage with them, the more troublesome it can be. So I like exactly how you said it there. We're learning to have a new relationship with our thoughts. And that implies we're not controlling, changing, removing, suppressing, all of that struggle type of stuff. We're just seeing them in a different light, seeing them from a different vantage point. We don't
Mm.
need to do anything to them. Thank you for that. I don't think we can repeat that metaphor enough. I think that's when I've seen people get that sort of light bulb in virtually every session when you use that example. So that's a great one. We're rapidly approaching the end of our slot. We've gone through some questions. If this is the first time you're encountering this, please go back to the resources page where you'll find links to all the previous episodes in this series, worklifepsych.com/psychological flexibility. You'll also be able to send us questions via there. And that will be where you will find details of the new course when that is live for signups. And the reason we're mentioning it well ahead of time is to flag that, you know, it's going to be in November. So it'll be past virtually everyone's summer holidays. And we're hoping people will have a little bit more headspace then.
Mm.
So no questions popping up. The session edited version of this is going to be available on the YouTube channel at worklifepsych.tv, where you can find all of the other content I put out there about this and coaching and well-being and productivity and all those other topics that we work with. Oh, thank you for that from Caroline. This has been a really fun, informative lunchtime. Thank you so much. You're very welcome. Thank you for joining us. To those of you watching, thank you. And we'll see you the next time we come together for something like this, hopefully this November on our course. But thanks for now.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
thanks, folks. Bye-bye.